My name is Danny Kaufman, and on May 9th, 1970, I was an 18-year-old college freshman at Kent State University when I made two decisions that would forever change my understanding of war, death, and the terrible price of political awakening. First, I took LSD for the first time in my life during a massive anti-war rally in Washington, D.C., hoping the drug would enhance my consciousness and deepen my commitment to the peace movement. Second, I allowed myself to truly confront what I had been avoiding for 8 months. The reality that my older brother Michael had been killed in Vietnam in September 1969, a loss I had been suppressing through denial, anger, and frantic political activism. What happened during those 12 hours of altered consciousness was both the most horrifying and most transformative experience of my young life, as the LSD stripped away every psychological defense I had built against grief and forced me to see not just my brother's death, but the deaths of thousands of other young men whose lives had been sacrificed for a war that seemed increasingly meaningless and immoral. I had grown up in a working-class Jewish family in Cleveland, where my father Nathan worked as a machinist, and my mother Ruth cleaned houses to help support our family's modest but comfortable lifestyle. Michael was 2 years older than me, the golden boy who excelled in everything: sports, academics, and the kind of natural leadership that made teachers and coaches predict he would accomplish great things with his life. When he graduated from high school in 1968, the Vietnam War was escalating rapidly, and like many young men from families without the resources for college deferments, Michael faced the choice between volunteering for military service or waiting to be drafted. "Danny, I know you think this war is wrong," Michael told me during one of our last conversations before he left for basic training, "but somebody has to go, and it might as well be me. Maybe if I do my duty over there, you won't have to. Maybe this will all be over before you turn 18. His decision to enlist in the army was motivated partly by patriotic duty, partly by practical necessity, and partly by his protective instincts toward his younger brother, who was already showing signs of the anti-war sentiment that was spreading through American high schools and colleges. The transformation of my political consciousness began during my senior year of high school, as the body counts from Vietnam mounted and the contradictions between government claims about the war's progress and the reality of escalating casualties became impossible to ignore. The Tet Offensive in early 1968 had shattered official narratives about American success in Southeast Asia, while the Democratic National Convention in Chicago had revealed the violent lengths to which authorities would go to suppress anti-war dissent. By the time I started college at Kent State in September 1969, I was already committed to the peace movement and convinced that the war was an immoral waste of young lives. The news of Michael's death reached us on a cold Tuesday morning in September 1969, delivered by a uniformed army officer who stood awkwardly in our living room while explaining that Specialist Michael Kaufman had been killed by enemy fire during a patrol near the Cambodian border. The official language of heroism and sacrifice felt hollow and meaningless as I watched my parents collapse under the weight of a loss that no amount of patriotic rhetoric could justify or heal. "Your brother died serving his country," the officer said, but all I could think was that my brother had died for nothing in a war that was destroying both Vietnam and America. My response to Michael's death was to throw myself completely into anti-war activism, channeling my grief and rage into organizing protests, distributing leaflets, and participating in every demonstration against the war that I could find. The work provided an outlet for emotions I couldn't otherwise process, while also giving me the illusion that I was honoring Michael's memory by fighting to prevent other families from experiencing our loss. But underneath the political activity was a deep well of denial about the reality of my brother's death, and my own responsibility for not trying harder to talk him out of enlisting. The Kent State campus in early 1970 was a hotbed of anti-war activity, with students organizing sit-ins, teach-ins, and demonstrations that reflected the growing national opposition to American involvement in Vietnam. The announcement of President Nixon's expansion of the war into Cambodia in late April triggered massive protests across the country, including the events at Kent State that would culminate in the National Guard shooting 4 students on May 4th, just 5 days before my own transformative experience in Washington. I had been present during the Kent State shootings, standing close enough to see Alison Krauss fall when the guardsmen opened fire on the crowd of students who were protesting the Cambodian invasion. The sight of American soldiers killing American students created a moment of crystalline clarity about the nature of the war and the government that was prosecuting it. "They're willing to kill us here, just like they're killing people in Vietnam," I wrote in my journal that night. There's no difference between what happened today and what's happening to Michael's friends over there. The massive anti-war rally planned for Washington, D.C. on May 9th represented an opportunity for the peace movement to respond to both the Cambodian invasion and the Kent State killings with a demonstration of unified opposition that would be impossible for the government to ignore. Buses full of students, clergy, veterans, and ordinary citizens converged on the nation's capital for what organizers promised would be the largest anti-war demonstration in American history. My decision to take LSD during the rally was motivated by curiosity about consciousness expansion and the belief that psychedelic drugs could enhance political awareness and spiritual insight. Several older students at Kent State had described acid experiences as profoundly transformative, providing access to levels of understanding and empathy that were impossible to achieve through normal consciousness. LSD shows you the truth about reality that society has trained you not to see, explained Jerry Morrison, a philosophy major who had become one of my guides into the counterculture scene that surrounded the anti-war movement. The tab of acid that Jerry gave me as we joined the massive crowd gathering on the National Mall was small and innocuous looking, nothing like the dangerous drug that government propaganda had taught me to fear. "This is pure stuff," Jerry assured me as I placed the tiny piece of paper on my tongue. "It'll take about an hour to kick in, but when it does, you're going to see the war and the world in ways you never imagined. Just remember, whatever you experience, it's showing you something true that you need to understand." As we moved through the crowd of protesters, I was struck by the diversity of people who had come to Washington to oppose the war. Students and professors, veterans and clergy, mothers and grandparents, all united by their conviction that American involvement in Vietnam was wrong and had to be stopped. The energy was electric but peaceful, with speakers, musicians, and organizers creating an atmosphere of celebration rather than confrontation. Before you continue this powerful journey of psychedelic revelation and anti-war awakening with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories about the individuals who discovered profound truths about war, peace, and human consciousness during America's most turbulent historical period. The onset of the LSD effects was gradual at first, beginning with subtle changes in perception and mood that made the colors of protest signs seem more vivid and the voices of speakers sound more resonant and meaningful. But as the drug's influence intensified, I began to experience something far more profound than enhanced sensory awareness, a dissolution of the psychological barriers that had been protecting me from fully confronting the reality of Michael's death and the horror of the war he had died fighting. The triggering moment came when one of the speakers began reading the names of American soldiers who had been killed in Vietnam, a ritualistic recitation that was meant to honor the dead while also demonstrating the human cost of the war. As name after name was called out, each representing a young life cut short, I found myself searching for Michael's name while simultaneously dreading the moment when I would hear it spoken aloud. Specialist Michael David Kaufman, Cleveland, Ohio, age 20, killed in action September 15, 1969, the speaker announced, and something inside me broke open like a dam that had been holding back months of suppressed grief and denial. The LSD had stripped away every defense mechanism I had constructed against the reality of my brother's death, leaving me completely vulnerable to emotions I had been avoiding since the day the Army officer came to our door. What happened next was the most intense and terrifying experience of my young life, as the combination of psychedelic consciousness and raw grief created hallucinations that were more vivid and real than anything I had ever experienced. The crowd around me seemed to fade away, replaced by visions of a Vietnamese battlefield where I could see Michael and hundreds of other dead American soldiers lying in the mud, their young faces frozen in expressions of fear, pain, and confused betrayal. The hallucinations that overwhelmed me during the peak of the LSD experience were not random psychedelic imagery, but devastatingly specific visions of death and suffering that felt more real than the anti-war rally happening around me. I could see Michael clearly among the bodies of fallen soldiers, his face pale and waxy, his eyes open but empty, his uniform torn and blood-stained. But he wasn't alone. Surrounding him were dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of other young men who had died in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam, all of them looking at me with expressions that seemed to ask why their deaths had been necessary and what their sacrifice had accomplished. "Danny, can you see us now?" I heard Michael's voice speaking directly into my consciousness, though his lips didn't move, and his body remained motionless among the other corpses. "Can you see what this war really is? Can you see what they did to all of us?" The voice was unmistakably my brother's, carrying the same gentle authority he had always used when trying to teach me something important, but now it was tinged with a sadness and wisdom that came from experiencing death at 20 years old. The vision expanded beyond American casualties to include Vietnamese civilians, children, mothers, elderly farmers, whose bodies were scattered among the soldiers, all victims of a conflict that seemed to consume everything it touched without regard for nationality, age, or innocence. The LSD had somehow opened a channel of perception that allowed me to see the full scope of suffering that the war was creating, not just the sanitized statistics reported in newspapers, but the actual human cost measured in destroyed lives and shattered families. "This is what you've been hiding from," Michael's voice continued as the hallucination intensified. "This is what you couldn't face when they told Mom and Dad I was dead. You threw yourself into protesting the war, but you never let yourself feel what my death really meant. You never mourned me, Danny. You never said goodbye." The accusation was devastating because it was absolutely true. Since receiving news of Michael's death 8 months earlier, I had channeled all my energy into political activism, using anger about the war to avoid dealing with grief about my personal loss. The anti-war movement had provided a framework for understanding Michael's death as part of a larger tragedy, but it had also allowed me to intellectualize my pain rather than experiencing it directly. The emotional breakthrough that followed was overwhelming and cathartic, as months of suppressed grief poured out of me in ways that were visible to other rally participants who had no idea what I was experiencing internally. I found myself sobbing uncontrollably while staring at empty space where others saw nothing but crowds of protesters, talking to my dead brother while appearing to be having a psychotic episode triggered by drugs and political stress. "Danny, what's happening to you?" Jerry Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away as he tried to anchor me to the reality of the rally, while I remained lost in visions of death and communication with my brother's spirit. "You're freaking out, man. You need to remember that you're safe here with us. Whatever you're seeing is just the acid, it's not real. But the experience felt more real than anything I had ever known, more authentic than the political rhetoric and protest slogans that had been sustaining me through the months since Michael's death. The LSD had dissolved the barriers between life and death, between past and present, between my conscious mind and the unconscious fears and griefs that I had been carrying without acknowledging their weight and power. "It is real," I managed to say to Jerry through my tears and hallucinations. "Michael is here, and all the other dead soldiers are here, and they're showing me what the war really looks like when you stop pretending it's about politics and admit it's about death." "They're all dead, Jerry. My brother is dead, and I never let myself understand what that meant." The vision began to shift as the LSD reached its peak intensity, expanding from the specific tragedy of Michael's death to encompass the broader human cost of war throughout history. I could see battlefields from World War I, World War II, Korea, and every other conflict where young men had died for causes they barely understood, their deaths justified by old men who never had to face the consequences of their political decisions. "War is always the same," Michael's voice explained as the hallucination continued. "The weapons change, the uniforms change, the countries change, but the reality is always young people dying for old people's ideas about power and territory and ideology. And the families always grieve, and the politicians always claim the deaths were necessary, and nothing ever really changes except that more people learn to live with unbearable loss. The anti-war rally that was happening around me began to take on new meaning as I understood it, not just as a political protest, but as a collective expression of grief and determination to prevent more deaths like Michael's. The speakers, the musicians, the protesters holding signs and chanting slogans, all of them were connected by their refusal to accept that war was inevitable or necessary, their insistence that there had to be better ways to resolve conflicts than sending young people to kill and die in foreign countries. The crowd of protesters began to seem like a community of mourners, each person carrying their own connections to the war's casualties, brothers, sons, friends, lovers who had been killed or wounded or psychologically damaged by their experiences in Vietnam. The political dimension of the demonstration was real and important, but underneath it was something more fundamental, a recognition that every war death represented an irreplaceable loss that diminished the entire human community. "Danny, you have to choose," Michael's voice said as the vision began to evolve towards some kind of resolution. "You can keep using politics to avoid feeling grief, or you can let yourself mourn me properly and then use that grief to fuel your commitment to preventing other families from experiencing what ours has experienced. But you can't do both. You can't be an effective anti-war activist while you're still running away from the reality of what war actually does to people." The choice Michael was offering me was between genuine political engagement and the superficial activism I had been practicing since his death. To become an authentic advocate for peace, I would have to stop using the movement as a way to avoid dealing with my personal loss, and instead allow that loss to deepen my understanding of why war was morally unacceptable and politically unsustainable. The integration of grief and activism that Michael was describing would require me to become vulnerable in ways that felt dangerous and unfamiliar. Instead of channeling anger and denial into protest activities, I would have to let myself feel the full weight of what his death meant, while using that emotional truth to motivate more effective and sustained opposition to the war. "I'm scared," I said to Michael's image, which was becoming less distinct as the LSD began to reach its peak and start its gradual decline. "I'm scared that if I let myself feel how much losing you hurts, I won't be able to function anymore. I'm scared that grief will make me weak instead of making me stronger." "Grief isn't weakness, Danny," Michael replied, his voice becoming fainter but more loving as the hallucination prepared to end. "Grief is love with nowhere to go. If you can figure out how to channel that love toward protecting other people's brothers, then my death will have meant something after all. But if you keep running from the pain, then I'll have died for nothing, and you'll have wasted the opportunity to turn loss into service." The gradual return to normal consciousness as the LSD effects subsided was marked by a profound sense of transformation and clarity that I had never experienced before. The visions of Michael and the battlefield dead faded slowly, but the emotional breakthrough they had precipitated remained vivid and permanent. For the first time since my brother's death, I had allowed myself to fully experience the reality of losing him. And that experience had changed my understanding of both grief and political action in ways that would shape the rest of my life. The anti-war rally continued around me as I slowly reintegrated with consensus reality, but I was now experiencing it as a fundamentally different person than the one who had taken LSD 6 hours earlier. The speakers, the crowd, the protest signs all looked the same, but I was seeing them through eyes that had been opened by psychedelic revelation and genuine mourning for my brother's death. Jerry Morrison's relief when he realized I was coming back from what had appeared to be a severe psychological crisis was obvious and touching. "Danny, you really had me worried there," he said, as I began to respond normally to questions and demonstrate awareness of my surroundings. "You were talking to someone who wasn't there and crying like your heart was broken. What did you see during that trip?" The explanation I gave Jerry about my experience was necessarily incomplete, as no words could convey the full intensity and meaning of what I had experienced during those hours of altered consciousness. But I tried to share the essential insight that the LSD had provided, that my anti-war activism had been motivated more by personal denial than by political conviction, and that authentic opposition to the war required genuine engagement with its human costs rather than abstract intellectual arguments about policy and morality. "I saw my brother Michael and all the other soldiers who died in Vietnam," I told Jerry, as we sat together on the grass while the rally continued around us. "He showed me that I've been using the peace movement to avoid dealing with losing him, and that if I really want to honor his memory, I need to let myself grieve for him while working to prevent other families from going through what mine has gone through." The integration of this revelation into my daily life proved to be a long and difficult process that extended far beyond the immediate effects of the psychedelic experience. The emotional breakthrough I had experienced at the rally opened the floodgates of grief that I had been suppressing for 8 months, leading to weeks of intense mourning that was both painful and necessary for my psychological healing. The support I received from other anti-war activists who had experienced similar losses helped me understand that I was not alone in struggling to balance personal grief with political engagement. The peace movement was full of people who had lost family members, friends and loved ones to the war, and many of them had found that their personal experiences of loss provided both motivation and authenticity to their activism. The most effective anti-war organizers are often the ones who have been personally affected by the war, observed Sarah Chen, a graduate student at Kent State who had lost her fiancé in Vietnam and had become one of the most respected leaders in our local peace movement. When you know what it feels like to lose someone you love to a war that doesn't make sense, you're not just opposing a policy, you're fighting to prevent other people from experiencing that same devastating loss. The evolution of my activism, after the LSD experience, was marked by greater emotional authenticity and deeper commitment to the practical work of ending the war rather than just expressing opposition to it. Instead of attending rallies primarily to vent anger and frustration, I began focusing on voter education, draft counseling, and other activities that might actually contribute to changing government policy and bringing American troops home from Vietnam. The relationship with my parents also changed significantly as I allowed myself to share grief with them, rather than just political arguments about the war. The common experience of mourning Michael's death created a bond that transcended our different opinions about Vietnam and military service, allowing us to support each other through loss while maintaining our respective perspectives on the larger political issues. "Danny, I can see that you're really hurting about Michael," my mother said during one of our conversations about how to cope with our shared loss. "I may not agree with your politics, but I understand that your anti-war work is your way of trying to make sense of losing him. That's not so different from your father and me, finding comfort in believing that Michael died serving his country with honor." The draft notice that arrived in my mailbox 6 months after the Washington rally forced me to confront the practical implications of my anti-war convictions and my commitment to honoring Michael's memory through opposition to the conflict that had killed him. The legal options available to me, student deferment, conscientious objector status, or resistance to the draft, each carried different moral and practical implications that required careful consideration of my principles and priorities. The decision to apply for conscientious objector status was based on the spiritual and ethical insights I had gained through the LSD experience and my subsequent integration of grief and political consciousness. The application process required detailed documentation of my religious and moral beliefs about war and violence, forcing me to articulate the philosophical framework that had emerged from my psychedelic revelation about the nature of armed conflict and the value of human life. "Mr. Kaufman, you claim that your opposition to war is based on deeply held religious convictions," observed the draft board member who interviewed me about my conscientious objector application. "But your anti-war activities suggest political motivations rather than spiritual ones. How do you distinguish between religious objection to war and political opposition to a particular military conflict?" My response drew directly on what I had learned during the LSD experience about the connection between personal loss and universal human suffering. "Sir, when my brother was killed in Vietnam, I learned that every war death is both a political event and a spiritual tragedy," I explained. "My religious conviction is that human life is sacred and that killing other people is wrong, regardless of the political justifications offered for violence. That conviction was deepened by my brother's death, but it extends to all wars, not just Vietnam. The conscientious objector status that was eventually granted to me allowed me to serve my military obligation through alternative service in a hospital where I worked with wounded veterans who were struggling to recover from physical and psychological injuries sustained in Vietnam. The work provided daily reminders of the war's human costs, while also giving me opportunities to serve people who had experienced trauma similar to what Michael had faced before his death. The wounded veterans I worked with during my alternative service taught me about aspects of the war that were not visible to anti-war protesters or government officials. Their stories about combat, moral injury, and the challenges of returning to civilian life helped me understand that ending the war was only the first step toward addressing its long-term consequences for everyone who had been affected by American involvement in Vietnam. "Kaufman, I heard your brother was killed over there," said Tommy Rodriguez, a Marine who had lost his leg to a landmine and was learning to walk with a prosthetic. "I want you to know that guys like your brother, they didn't die for nothing. They died because they cared about their country and their buddies. The war might have been wrong, but the soldiers who fought it weren't wrong. Your brother was a good man doing his duty." The perspective offered by veterans like Tommy helped me develop a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between opposing the war and honoring the soldiers who had fought it. The LSD experience had shown me that Michael's death was tragic and unnecessary, but my work with wounded veterans taught me that his service had also been motivated by love and loyalty that deserved respect, even within the context of political opposition to the conflict. The long-term impact of my psychedelic revelation at the anti-war rally extended far beyond the immediate effects of the drug experience to influence my entire approach to political engagement, personal relationships, and spiritual development. The insight that authentic activism required genuine emotional engagement with the issues at stake became a guiding principle that shaped my involvement with various social justice causes throughout my adult life. Looking back on that transformative day in Washington, D.C., I understand that the LSD did not create the grief and political consciousness that emerged during my experience. It simply removed the psychological barriers that had been preventing me from accessing emotions and insights that were already present within me. The drug served as a catalyst for confronting truths about Michael's death and the war that I had been avoiding through denial and superficial activism. The anti-war movement ultimately succeeded in helping to end American involvement in Vietnam. But the personal transformation I experienced through grieving my brother's death proved to be even more significant for my development as a human being. Learning to integrate loss with love, pain with purpose, and personal experience with political conviction became the foundation for a life of meaningful engagement with the world's suffering and possibilities for healing. The vision of Michael among the dead soldiers that I experienced during the LSD trip remained vivid and meaningful throughout my life, serving as a reminder that every political issue involves real human beings who deserve to be honored through authentic, rather than superficial responses to injustice. The brother I lost to the Vietnam War became my teacher about the connections between grief and activism, showing me that the most effective opposition to violence comes from people who understand personally what violence destroys and who are motivated by love rather than hatred to work for peace.